Have you ever wondered what it feels like to stand on a wooden platform, chains around your wrists, while strangers examine your teeth like you were cattle at a county fair? What goes through a man's mind when he realizes that in the next 5 minutes, someone will buy him, own him, decide whether he lives or dies? Most people never think about it. Most people scroll past these stories. But you stopped here, and I think there is a reason for that. Something inside you knows that what happened on that sweltering October afternoon in New Orleans was not just another slave auction. It was something else entirely. Something that authorities tried to bury. Something that plantation owners whispered about in terror for years afterward. A secret so dangerous that newspapers refused to print it, and witnesses swore never to speak of it again. What you are about to hear has been pieced together from court documents that were hidden for over a century, from letters that slave catchers wrote to their employers, from the trembling testimonies of those who were there that day and saw something they could not explain. I have spent months researching this case, and I still cannot fully comprehend how one man, standing in chains, surrounded by armed guards, with absolutely no way out, managed to do what he did. If you appreciate stories that reveal the hidden truths of history, the ones that powerful people never wanted you to know, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now. Because what I'm about to tell you will change everything you thought you knew about resistance, about courage, and about the unbreakable spirit that burns inside human beings when they are pushed to the absolute edge. This is the story of Solomon Beaumont. And his secret died with him. Until now. The St. Louis Hotel auction room still stands in the French Quarter of New Orleans, though tourists who walk past it today have no idea what happened within those walls. The building itself seems to remember. The wooden floors creak in strange patterns. The air feels heavier there than anywhere else on that street. Local guides avoid talking about the room on the second floor, the one with the rotunda ceiling and the curved balcony where wealthy buyers once sat with numbered paddles in their hands. In October of 1857, that room was the center of a thriving industry. Human beings were bought and sold there every Tuesday and Thursday, sometimes as many as 40 people in a single afternoon. The auctioneers wore fine suits and spoke in theatrical voices, describing the merchandise in clinical detail. Age, height, weight, scars, teeth condition, breeding potential. These words were recorded in ledgers that still exist in Louisiana archives, their pages yellowed and their ink faded, but the horror preserved perfectly. The auction block itself was a raised platform made of cypress wood, polished smooth by the feet of thousands who had stood upon it. There were iron rings embedded in the floor where chains could be attached. There was a smaller platform to the side where children were displayed separately, and another section behind a curtain where women were examined privately by potential buyers. The walls of that room absorbed screams that never stopped echoing. The plaster remembers. The chandeliers that hung from the ceiling witnessed everything and told no one. This was the machine. This was the system. This was the place where Solomon Beaumont was scheduled to be sold on October 14, 1857, at approximately 3 in the afternoon. He had been brought there in a wagon covered with canvas, along with 11 other people from the Duvalier plantation in Terrebonne Parish. His wrists were bound with rope that had been soaked in salt water to prevent him from working the knots loose. His ankles were connected by a chain just long enough to allow him to shuffle forward, but not long enough to let him run. He was 34 years old. He weighed 170 pounds. He had all his teeth except for one molar that had been knocked out 3 years earlier, when an overseer struck him with a shovel handle. His back carried the topography of his suffering, 17 scars from whippings that had been administered over the course of his lifetime, the oldest dating back to when he was 8 years old, and had dropped a water pitcher in the main house. He was being sold because the Duvalier plantation was being liquidated. The owner, Michel Duvalier, had gambled away his fortune on cotton futures that never materialized, and his creditors demanded immediate payment. Everything had to go. The furniture, the livestock, the equipment, the people. Solomon was listed in the inventory as one Negro man, skilled in ironwork, value estimated at $1,400. But the estimate was wrong. Solomon was worth much more than that. And the secret of why he was worth more was the very thing that would make his escape possible. If you want to follow more cases like this one, cases that shake society to its core and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss a single investigation. The Duvalier plantation sat on 1,400 acres along Bayou Terrebonne, 60 miles southwest of New Orleans. The main house was a Greek revival structure, with 8 columns across the front, and a widow's walk on the roof where Madame Duvalier once stood watching for her husband's steamboat to appear around the bend. The house had 22 rooms, and Solomon knew every one of them. He knew which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck in humid weather, which windows could be opened silently, and which ones groaned. He knew these things because for 15 years he had been responsible for maintaining every piece of iron, every hinge, every lock, every chain on that property. Solomon was a blacksmith. But calling him a blacksmith was like calling Leonardo da Vinci a painter. It captured the basic truth but missed the magnitude. Solomon could forge anything. He had learned the trade from his father, who had learned it in the forges of the Senegambian coast before being captured and brought to the Louisiana Territory in 1798. His father had been a master metalworker in his homeland, a man who made tools and weapons for his village, and he had passed every secret of the craft to his son before dying of fever when Solomon was 19. By the time Solomon turned 25, he was the most skilled ironworker in Terrebonne Parish. Plantation owners from neighboring properties would send their broken equipment to him: sugar mill gears, cotton gin mechanisms, carriage axles, gate hinges. All of it passed through Solomon's hands. He could look at a piece of twisted metal and understand exactly how it had failed, and exactly how to make it stronger. He forged the decorative ironwork that still adorns the Duvalier family tomb in the parish cemetery. He created the intricate lock system for Michel Duvalier's private study, a system so complex that even the locksmith brought in from New Orleans could not duplicate it. And here was the thing that nobody talked about, the thing that made certain people very nervous. Solomon understood locks better than anyone in Louisiana. He understood how they worked, how they failed, how they could be opened without keys. He had this knowledge because his job required him to repair them, to replace them, to maintain them. But knowledge is a dangerous thing. It does not stay contained. It spreads. It multiplies. It waits for the right moment to become useful. Michel Duvalier was not a stupid man. He recognized that Solomon's skills made him valuable, but they also made him dangerous. A man who can forge keys can forge freedom. So Duvalier took precautions. Solomon was never allowed off the plantation alone. When he traveled to neighboring properties for ironwork jobs, he was always accompanied by an overseer with a shotgun. His quarters were searched regularly for any unauthorized metal. He was forbidden from working at night unless directly supervised. And still, somehow, over the course of 15 years, Solomon had managed to create something in secret, something that would only reveal its purpose on that October afternoon in New Orleans. The overseer at Duvalier Plantation was a man named Cornelius Whitmore. He had served in the Mexican-American War, where he had developed a taste for violence that peacetime could not satisfy. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall, with a face that looked like it had been carved from a cypress stump and left out in the weather for a decade. His eyes were the color of dirty ice, and they never seemed to blink when he was watching the enslaved workers in the fields. He carried a cowhide whip that he called Delilah, and he spoke to it sometimes late at night, when he thought no one could hear. Whitmore had a particular hatred for Solomon. Part of it was envy. Whitmore could barely write his own name, while Solomon could read, write, and perform mathematical calculations that Whitmore could not begin to comprehend. Part of it was fear. Whitmore understood on some animal level that Solomon was smarter than him, that Solomon saw through his posturing and his cruelty to the small, frightened man underneath. And part of it was simply the hatred that mediocrity feels for excellence, the burning resentment of a man who knows he will never be great toward a man who already is. Whitmore had whipped Solomon 7 times over the course of 15 years. Each time had been for a minor infraction that another worker would have received a verbal warning for. A tool left in the wrong place. A delay in completing a repair. A look that Whitmore interpreted as disrespectful. The whippings were not about punishment. They were about reminding Solomon of his place. They were about breaking something that Whitmore could sense, but not name. They never worked. Solomon would stand at the whipping post with his hands bound above his head, and he would not scream. He would breathe slowly and steadily while the leather cut into his flesh, and his eyes would stare at some fixed point in the distance, and Whitmore would feel himself becoming smaller and smaller with every stroke that failed to produce a cry. This silence drove Whitmore to escalation. In January of 1857, 9 months before the auction, Whitmore decided to break Solomon once and for all. He announced that Solomon's wife, a woman named Patience who worked in the main house kitchen, would be sold to a plantation in Mississippi. The sale was arranged. The buyer arrived. Papers were signed. Patience was taken away in a wagon while Solomon stood watching from the forge, unable to move, unable to speak, his hands gripping the handle of a hammer so tightly that the wood splintered. That night, Solomon went into the swamp behind the slave quarters and did not return until dawn. Nobody knew what he did out there. Some said they heard hammering, faint and rhythmic, carrying across the still water. Some said they heard singing, low and mournful, in a language that none of them recognized. When Solomon came back, something in his eyes had changed. The light was still there, but it had a different quality now. It was harder, sharper, more patient. The overseer Whitmore saw this change and felt afraid for the first time since the war. But he did not know what to do about it. You do not discipline a man for the look in his eyes. You do not whip someone for appearing calm. And so the months passed, and the Duvalier fortune crumbled, and the auction date was set, and Solomon waited. Leave a comment below saying never give up on truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The night before the auction, the 12 people from Duvalier Plantation were held in a slave pen on Baronne Street in New Orleans. These pens were holding facilities where enslaved people were kept before and between sales, and they were designed to prepare the merchandise for presentation. The men were shaved, and their skin was oiled to make them appear healthier. The women were given clean clothes and their hair was styled. Scars were treated with ointments that made them less visible. The pen on Baronne Street was run by a dealer named Thaddeus Crane, a thin man with nervous hands who always smelled faintly of camphor. Crane moved through the holding cells that night, inspecting his inventory, making notes in a leather-bound ledger. When he came to Solomon, he stopped. There was something about this one. Crane had been in the business for 23 years, and he had developed an instinct for trouble. Most enslaved people, when they first arrived at the pen, showed certain predictable signs: fear, despair, resignation, rage that eventually burned itself out into hopelessness. Solomon showed none of these things. He sat on the wooden bench in his cell with his hands resting on his knees, and he watched Crane the way a hawk watches a mouse. Not with threat, not with anger, just with absolute, unwavering attention. Crane made a note in his ledger. Lot 7, ironworker. Watch closely. Then he moved on, because there were 11 other people to inspect, and only so many hours until dawn. He did not notice that Solomon's right hand, the one that was not visible from the corridor, was slowly working at something concealed in his trouser cuff. He did not hear the tiny clicks and scrapes of metal against metal. He did not see the small smile that crossed Solomon's face when the work was finally complete. The thing that Solomon had been building in secret for 15 years was now ready. October 14th, 1857, began with rain. It was not a gentle rain, but a Louisiana downpour, the kind that fills the streets with brown water and drives even the stray dogs to seek shelter under galleries. By mid-morning, the storm had passed and left behind a humidity so thick that men's shirts were soaked through before they finished their first cup of coffee. The St. Louis Hotel auction room was packed by 2 in the afternoon. The Duvalier sale had attracted significant interest because the inventory included several skilled workers, and skilled workers were becoming harder to find. The Cotton Kingdom was expanding westward, and demand for labor had never been higher. Buyers had come from as far as Texas and Arkansas. They sat in the curved gallery, fanning themselves with printed catalogs, their paddles ready. The auction began at 2:15 with the household goods, furniture, silver, china, paintings. These items went quickly, sold to speculators and dealers who would resell them at profit in the weeks to come. At 2:45, the enslaved people were brought out. They had been held in a room behind the main hall, and they were led through a side door one at a time, stepping up onto the wooden platform where the auctioneer waited with his gavel. The first to be sold was a woman named Celia, who had worked in the Duvalier dairy. She went for $600 to a buyer from Natchez. The second was a man named Thomas, a field hand in his early 20s, who sold for $900 to a cotton planter from East Texas. The third, fourth, fifth, sixth sold in quick succession, their lives changing hands with the tap of a gavel, their futures decided in moments that lasted less than a minute each. Solomon was the seventh to be called. He walked through the side door with his chains rattling against the polished floor. He climbed the 3 steps to the platform. He stood before the crowd with his back straight and his chin level, and he did not look down. The auctioneer, a florid man named Bertrand Lacroix, began his presentation. "Gentlemen, I direct your attention to Lot 7, a Negro man of approximately 34 years, in excellent physical condition despite some scarring, trained as a blacksmith and iron worker of extraordinary skill, capable of repairs to sugar mill machinery, cotton gin equipment, and decorative metalwork of the highest quality. Previous owner valued this property at $1,400, but given the demonstrated abilities, we shall begin the bidding at $1,200. Do I hear $1,200? A paddle went up from a man in the front row. Lacroix smiled. $1,200 to the gentleman in the blue coat. Do I hear 13? Another paddle. The bidding climbed steadily. 1,300, 1,400, 1,500. The buyers were interested. A skilled blacksmith was worth 5 field hands, maybe more. 1,600, 1,700. Solomon stood motionless on the platform, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the heads of the crowd. He was counting seconds in his mind. He was feeling the small weight hidden against his left wrist, tucked inside the band of iron that bound his arm. He was waiting for a specific moment. And then the moment came. At exactly 3:07 in the afternoon, a commotion erupted at the main entrance of the auction room. 2 men were shouting at each other near the door. A woman screamed. A chair fell over with a crash that echoed off the rotunda ceiling. Every head in the room turned toward the disturbance. Every eye left Solomon for just an instant. That instant was enough. What happened next was witnessed by only 3 people who were positioned at angles where they could see both the platform and the entrance simultaneously. Their accounts, given later to investigators, were confused and contradictory. One said that Solomon seemed to flicker, like a candle flame in a draft. One said that the chains fell away from his wrists like they were made of paper. One said that Solomon did not move at all, that he was simply standing on the platform one moment, and then he was not. The commotion at the door resolved itself within seconds. The 2 men who had been shouting were separated by guards. The woman who had screamed was escorted outside. The fallen chair was righted. The room returned its attention to the auction platform. Solomon was gone. The chains that had bound his wrists lay coiled on the wooden floor like sleeping snakes. The iron cuff that had connected his ankles was open, its lock mechanism exposed. The platform was empty. The auctioneer stood frozen with his gavel raised. The buyers sat in stunned silence, their paddles forgotten in their laps. A man in his position, chained, guarded, surrounded by a crowd of hostile witnesses, had vanished in the time it took to glance away. And no one had seen him leave. The chaos that followed was total. Bertrand Lacroix dropped his gavel. Someone in the gallery shouted for the doors to be locked. Guards rushed forward, pushing through the crowd, looking for any sign of the escaped man. The auction room became a scene of confusion as buyers stood up from their seats, craning their necks, asking each other what had happened. Thaddeus Crane, the dealer who had noted Solomon's strange calmness the night before, pushed his way to the platform and stared at the abandoned chains. His hands were shaking. In 23 years, he had never seen anything like this. He had heard of escapes from pens, from plantations, from wagons and boats and holding cells, but never from an auction in progress. Never from a platform surrounded by 100 witnesses. Never without any sign of struggle or flight. He picked up one of the iron cuffs and examined it. The lock mechanism had been opened cleanly, precisely, without any visible damage to the metal. It was the work of someone who understood exactly how the lock functioned and exactly what sequence of movements would release it. The distraction at the door had not been an accident. The timing had been too perfect. Someone had been helping Solomon. But who? And how had he gotten out of the room? The doors were guarded. The windows were 20 feet above street level. There was no back exit from the auction hall, yet Solomon had disappeared as completely as if he had evaporated into the humid Louisiana air. The search began immediately. Guards spread through the St. Louis Hotel, checking every room, every closet, every service corridor. They searched the kitchen, the laundry, the wine cellar. They questioned staff members who had been working during the auction. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. Solomon Beaumont had ceased to exist. Outside the hotel, the news spread through the French Quarter with the speed of a river fire. A slave had escaped from the auction block, not from a pen or a plantation, but from the block itself, in front of 100 buyers, in the middle of a sale. By evening, the story had reached every coffee house and tavern in New Orleans. By the next morning, it was in the newspapers. And by the end of the week, it had traveled by steamboat and stagecoach to every corner of the South, growing larger and more impossible with each retelling. The man responsible for the distraction at the door was named Philippe Marchand. He was a free man of color, a carpenter who lived in the Treme neighborhood and who had known Solomon for 12 years. They had met when Marchand was hired to do woodworking repairs at a neighboring plantation, and Solomon had forged new hinges for a door that Marchand was building. They had discovered a mutual interest in the mechanics of things, the way that systems worked, the hidden logic of locks and joints and mechanisms. Over the years, they had found ways to communicate. Marchand would pass through Terrebonne Parish on legitimate carpentry jobs, and he would stop at the forge to commission some piece of ironwork or other. During these visits, they would talk, they would plan, they would share information. Marchand was connected to a network of free black people and white abolitionists who operated what would later be called the Underground Railroad. He knew safe houses, routes, contacts, forgers who could create free papers. And Solomon knew locks. Together, they had devised a plan that required 15 years to execute. The key, literally and figuratively, was a set of tools that Solomon had forged one piece at a time over the course of those 15 years. Each piece was small enough to be concealed, innocent-looking enough to pass inspection. A thin strip of spring steel disguised as a repair to his belt buckle, a curved pick hidden inside the handle of his personal hammer, a tension wrench embedded in the sole of his shoe. Separately, these items were meaningless. Together, they formed a complete set of lock-picking tools capable of opening any standard restraint used in the slave trade. Solomon had tested his skills on every lock he could access during his legitimate work. He had practiced until he could open a standard wrist cuff in under 3 seconds, by touch alone, without looking. He had learned the variations between different manufacturers, the weaknesses in different designs. By the time he was brought to New Orleans for the auction, he could have escaped from his chains at any moment. But escaping was not enough. He needed to disappear, and for that, he needed help. Marchand had arranged everything. The 2 men at the door were accomplices, free black sailors from a ship docked at the waterfront, who had agreed to create a distraction in exchange for a payment that Marchand had gathered from sympathizers in the Treme community. The woman who screamed was another member of the network, a Creole shopkeeper who attended auctions regularly to gather intelligence about who was being sold and where they were being sent. In the 3 seconds that every eye was turned toward the door, Solomon had opened his cuffs, slipped off the platform on the side away from the crowd, dropped through a trapdoor that led to a service basement beneath the auction hall, and vanished into a tunnel that connected to the building next door. The trapdoor had been left unlocked by a hotel employee who was part of Marchand's network, a man who had been paid to ensure that the lock was not secured that morning. The tunnel had been used for decades to move supplies between buildings without exposure to weather. It emerged in the courtyard of a townhouse on Chartres Street, a house owned by a white abolitionist named Dr. Charles Beaumont, no relation to Solomon despite the shared surname. Dr. Beaumont had purchased Solomon's freedom on paper, using forged documents that described a sale that had never occurred. Within an hour of his disappearance, Solomon was in clean clothes, carrying papers that identified him as a free man, walking calmly down the street toward the waterfront, where a ship called the Morning Star was preparing to depart for Boston. But Solomon did not board the Morning Star. Something had changed in his calculations. something that no one had anticipated. As he walked toward the waterfront, Solomon passed a notice board outside a slave trader's office. Handwritten notices were pinned to the board, advertisements for slaves for sale, rewards for runaways, and shipping schedules. One notice caught his eye. It was an announcement for an upcoming auction in Natchez, Mississippi, scheduled for October 22nd. Among the items listed was a woman named Patience, described as a skilled cook, approximately 30 years of age, property of the Greyhound Plantation. His wife. She had not been sent to some distant, unknown location. She was in Natchez, 150 miles upriver, scheduled to be sold in 8 days. Solomon looked at the notice for a long time. He felt the weight of the free papers in his pocket, the papers that represented everything that he and Marchand had worked toward for 15 years. He felt the pull of the ship at the waterfront, the path to freedom, to the north, to a life where no one could ever chain him again. And then he turned away from the harbor and began walking north along the river road. He would not leave Louisiana without his wife. Dr. Beaumont tried to stop him. Marchand tried to reason with him. They explained that going to Natchez was suicide, that the entire region was now on alert for an escaped slave matching his description, that the papers he carried might not survive close inspection. Solomon listened to their arguments. He thanked them for their help, and then he continued walking. He was going to Natchez. He was going to find Patience, and he was going to free her, or die trying. The journey from New Orleans to Natchez took Solomon 11 days. He traveled at night, following the river but staying away from the main roads. He slept during the day in swamps and abandoned barns and hollowed-out cypress trees. He ate whatever he could find: wild berries, fish that he caught with his hands, corn stolen from fields in the darkness. His clothes became ragged, his face grew gaunt, but he kept moving, night after night, mile after mile, toward the woman he had sworn to protect and failed to save. The countryside was alive with rumors about his escape. At crossroads taverns and plantation dining rooms, men talked about the impossible disappearance from the St. Louis hotel auction. The story had grown in the telling. Some said that Solomon had magical powers, that he could make himself invisible, that he was a conjurer from Africa who could not be held by mortal chains. Others said that it was a hoax, that the auction house had staged the escape to generate publicity, that no such person had ever existed. The truth was stranger than either tale. Solomon was neither magical nor fictional. He was a man with 15 years of preparation and 30 seconds of opportunity, and he had made the most of both. But the search for him was real. Slave catchers had been dispatched throughout the region, men with dogs and guns and legal authority to detain any black person who could not prove their free status. The reward for Solomon's capture had been set at $500, a fortune for the kind of men who hunted runaways for a living. The description that circulated was detailed: approximately 34 years, medium height, muscular build, extensive scarring on back, skilled with metalwork. Solomon knew that his free papers might not protect him. If a slave catcher saw the scars on his back, no document in the world would save him. Free men did not carry those marks. Only the enslaved bore that particular testimony. So he stayed hidden. He moved like a ghost through the Louisiana and Mississippi bottomlands, invisible to the world that was hunting him. And on the evening of October 21st, one day before the scheduled auction, he reached the outskirts of Natchez. Natchez was a city of contradictions. On the bluff overlooking the Mississippi River stood the grand mansions of the cotton aristocracy, their white columns gleaming in the sunset, their gardens fragrant with magnolia and jasmine. Below the bluff, in the area known as Natchez Under the Hill, was a different world entirely. The Under the Hill district was a tangle of taverns, gambling halls, and brothels that served the steamboat trade. It was a place where men were killed over card games and bodies were dumped in the river before dawn. It was also a place where a stranger could pass unnoticed, where no one asked too many questions, where information could be purchased if you knew whom to ask. Solomon arrived in Natchez Under the Hill just as the evening shift was beginning at the waterfront saloons. He had traded his ragged clothes for a set of worn but respectable garments that he had found drying on a line outside a farmhouse. He walked into a tavern called the Rusty Anchor and ordered a cup of coffee, paying with coins that Dr. Beaumont had given him in New Orleans. He sat in a corner and watched and listened. Within an hour, he had learned what he needed to know. The auction was to be held at the Forks of the Road, the largest slave market in Mississippi, located at the intersection of two main roads on the eastern edge of town. Patience was being held at the Greyhound Plantation, 3 miles north of the market, where she would remain until she was transported for sale the following morning. The plantation was owned by a man named William Crockett, who had purchased Patience from the Duvalier estate sale and was now reselling her because she had proven difficult. Difficult. The word made Solomon's chest tight. He knew what difficult meant. It meant that Patience had not submitted. It meant that she had resisted, in whatever small ways were available to her. It meant that she was still fighting. He left the tavern and walked north through the darkness, following directions that a drunken sailor had given him in exchange for a silver dollar. The road to Greyhound Plantation wound through cotton fields that glowed pale under the rising moon. The air smelled of river mud and wood smoke. Solomon moved silently along the edge of the road, staying in the shadows of the live oaks that lined the way. He reached the plantation gate just before midnight. The main house was dark, except for a single light in an upstairs window. The slave quarters were a row of wooden cabins set back from the house, barely visible in the moonlight. Solomon circled the property, studying the layout, noting the positions of doors and windows, counting the dogs that lay sleeping on the porches. He identified the cabin where the house servants would be kept, the one closest to the kitchen dependency. That was where Patience would be. He waited until the light in the upstairs window went out. He waited another hour, until he was certain that the household was deeply asleep, and then he moved. The door of the cabin was secured with a simple padlock, the kind that Solomon had opened 1,000 times. He had it off in less than 2 seconds, without making a sound. The inside of the cabin was dark and close, smelling of bodies and sweat, and the faint sweetness of corn pone. Solomon stood just inside the door, letting his eyes adjust. He could make out shapes on the floor, sleeping figures wrapped in blankets, crowded together for warmth despite the mild night. He moved through the cabin slowly, stepping carefully between the sleeping forms, searching for one particular shape. He found her in the far corner, curled on her side with her back to the wall. Even in the darkness, he knew her. The curve of her shoulder, the way her hair fell across her face, the small sound she made when she breathed, halfway between a whisper and a sigh. He knelt beside her and placed his hand gently over her mouth. Her eyes snapped open. For a moment, there was terror in them, the reflexive fear of a woman who had learned to expect violence. Then recognition, then disbelief, then tears. Solomon leaned close and whispered in her ear, "It is me. I came back. We are leaving. Now." Patience nodded against his hand. She rose silently, gathering nothing, leaving everything behind. They moved to the door, stepping over the sleeping forms, pausing at every sound. Outside, the night was still. The dogs had not woken. The house remained dark. They crossed the yard and slipped through a gap in the fence and vanished into the cotton fields beyond. They walked until dawn, heading northeast toward the Alabama border. They walked for 3 more nights, resting during the days in swamps and caves and abandoned buildings. On the 4th night, they reached a safe house operated by the Underground Railroad, a farmhouse in the Alabama hill country where a Quaker family hid runaways in a secret cellar beneath their barn. From there, they were passed to another safe house, and another, a chain of courage that stretched across the South like a secret river flowing north. They reached Ohio in November. They crossed into Canada in December. They settled in a small town near Toronto, where Solomon established a blacksmith shop that became known throughout the region for the quality of its work. He never returned to the United States. He lived for another 32 years, dying peacefully in 1889 at the age of 66. Patience outlived him by 5 years. They had 4 children, 14 grandchildren, and a legacy that their descendants carry to this day. But the story does not end with their escape. What happened in the weeks and months after Solomon's disappearance from the New Orleans auction was, in many ways, more significant than the escape itself. The news of his vanishing spread throughout the South like a contagion. Plantation owners heard the story and felt a chill run through them. If a man could disappear from an auction block in front of 100 witnesses, what else was possible? What other impossible things might their enslaved workers be planning at this very moment? The authorities responded with predictable brutality. Every free black person in New Orleans was subjected to increased scrutiny. Papers were demanded, checked, and rechecked. Several free men and women were arrested on suspicion of aiding the escape, though none could be proven guilty. Philippe Marchand, the carpenter who had organized the distraction, fled to Haiti before he could be questioned. The two sailors who had caused the commotion at the door shipped out on a vessel bound for Liverpool and never returned to American waters. Dr. Charles Beaumont, the white abolitionist who had provided forged papers and shelter, was questioned intensively, but claimed ignorance of any conspiracy. His house was searched. The tunnel beneath it was discovered, but by then, Solomon was long gone, and there was no direct evidence connecting the doctor to the escape. He was released with a warning. He continued his work with the Underground Railroad until the Civil War made such work unnecessary. But the real impact of Solomon's escape was not measured in arrests or investigations. It was measured in fear. For the first time, the slaveholding class confronted the possibility that their system might be more fragile than they had believed. If locks could not hold a determined man, what could? If chains could be opened in seconds, what security existed? If a slave could vanish from under the very noses of his purchasers, what control did anyone really have? The story of Solomon Beaumont became a legend. It was told in slave quarters throughout the South, whispered from one person to another in the darkness. Each telling added new details. Solomon became a figure of supernatural power, a man who could walk through walls, who could turn invisible, who could not be caught by any hunter or held by any chain. These exaggerations were useful. They planted seeds of hope in hearts that had nearly given up. They suggested that escape was not impossible, that the system was not invincible, that freedom might be waiting for those brave enough to seize it. And they frightened the masters. Oh, how they frightened the masters. In December of 1857, a planter in Alabama wrote to his brother in Georgia, "There is a madness spreading among the Negroes. They speak of a man who escaped from an auction in New Orleans, who disappeared like smoke, who could not be held. They believe that if he could do it, they can do it too. I have increased the patrols, but I cannot patrol their minds. I cannot chain their dreams." Similar letters were written throughout the South in the weeks and months that followed. Planters reported increased incidents of resistance, tools broken, crops damaged, animals gone missing. Some reported attempted escapes by workers who had never before shown signs of restlessness. The authorities attributed this to the approaching conflict between North and South, to the inflammatory rhetoric of abolitionists, to the pernicious influence of Northern newspapers. But the enslaved people themselves knew better. They knew that something had changed. They knew that a man named Solomon had done the impossible, and if one man could do it, so could another. The escape from the auction block became part of a larger pattern of resistance that would continue to build until it erupted in the Civil War. Solomon Beaumont never knew the full impact of his action. He lived quietly in Canada, forging iron, raising children, growing old beside the woman he had refused to leave behind. But the ripples of his 30-second disappearance spread outward through time, touching lives he would never meet, inspiring courage in people who only knew him as a legend. That is the nature of resistance. It multiplies, it echoes, it lives on. There were those who tried to diminish what Solomon had accomplished. Some claimed that the entire story was an invention, a myth created by abolitionists to stir up trouble. Others insisted that Solomon must have had inside help from white sympathizers, that a black man could not have engineered such an escape on his own. Still others suggested that the escape was not really so remarkable, that the guards must have been drunk or inattentive, that the locks must have been defective. These explanations missed the point entirely. Solomon had indeed had help. He had had the help of Philippe Marchand and the network of free black people who risked their lives to assist runaways. He had had the help of Dr. Beaumont and the white abolitionists who provided resources and shelter. He had had the help of his father, who had passed down the knowledge of metalworking across an ocean and through generations of bondage. He had had the help of every enslaved person who had ever dreamed of freedom and refused to surrender that dream. But the plan was his. The execution was his. The courage was his. The 15 years of patient preparation. The thousands of hours practicing lockpicking by touch alone. The willingness to walk back into danger for the sake of love. These were Solomon's, and no one could take them from him. The locks that held him were real. The chains were strong. The guards were attentive. The system was designed by experts in human containment, and Solomon broke it anyway. He broke it with his mind. He broke it with his hands. He broke it with a faith in his own possibility that the system tried every day to destroy. That is not a myth. That is not an exaggeration. That is the simple truth of what one man did when he refused to accept that his life was not his own. The records of the St. Louis hotel auction were preserved in the archives of Orleans Parish, where they gathered dust for more than a century. In 1972, a historian named Dr. Eleanor Washington was researching the economics of the New Orleans slave trade when she discovered a peculiar entry in the October 1857 ledger. Lot 7, it read, "Iron worker, sold." But the word "sold" had been crossed out and replaced with "escaped." Next to this entry was a notation in different handwriting. See Incident Report. Dr. Washington searched for the incident report. She found it in a separate box of miscellaneous documents, a handwritten account by the auctioneer Bertrand Lacroix, describing in detail what had happened on October 14, 1857. The account matched the oral traditions that Dr. Washington had collected from descendants of enslaved people in Louisiana and Mississippi. The legend, it turned out, was true. Dr. Washington spent the next 15 years tracing Solomon's journey. She found letters from slave catchers describing their failed attempts to recapture him. She found newspaper articles from the weeks after the escape, describing the panic that gripped the planter class. She found records from the underground railroad stations that had sheltered Solomon and patients on their journey north. And finally, she found the descendants themselves, the great-great-grandchildren of Solomon and Patience Beaumont, living in Canada and the northern United States, still telling the story of how their ancestor had vanished from an auction block in New Orleans and walked into legend. Dr. Washington published her findings in 1991 in a book titled Vanishing Point: The True Story of Solomon Beaumont. The book received modest attention from academic circles, but never reached a wide popular audience. Solomon's story remained largely unknown outside of specialist historians and the communities that had preserved his memory across generations. Until now. If you watched until here, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying "I watched until here" so I can know who you are and who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video, if the story of Solomon touched your heart. Share so that the memory of Solomon is never forgotten. The tools that Solomon used to escape were never recovered. Dr. Washington speculated that he probably disposed of them during his journey north, discarding the incriminating evidence that could have revealed his method. But one artifact did survive. In 1943, a woman in Toronto named Margaret Beaumont Lewis, Solomon's great-granddaughter, donated a small wooden box to the Royal Ontario Museum. Inside the box was a set of handmade ironworking tools, a small hammer, a pair of tongs, and several implements whose purpose was not immediately clear. The museum cataloged them as examples of 19th-century blacksmithing equipment and placed them in storage. They remained there, unexamined, for nearly 50 years. In 1989, a museum conservator named David Chen was conducting an inventory of the metalworking collection when he noticed something unusual about one of the tools. It was a thin strip of spring steel, curved at one end with a peculiar hook-shaped tip. Chen, who had an interest in historical locks and security devices, recognized it immediately. It was a lock pick. Specifically, it was a pick designed to open the type of wrist cuff used in the American slave trade. Chen examined the other tools in the box. Several of them, he realized, were not blacksmithing implements at all. They were lock-picking devices, carefully disguised to look like ordinary workshop equipment. One was hidden inside a belt buckle. Another was embedded in a hammer handle. A third was concealed in the lining of what appeared to be a leather tool pouch. Chen contacted Dr. Washington, whose book on Solomon Beaumont had recently been published. Together they examined the artifacts and confirmed their suspicions. These were the tools that Solomon had forged piece by piece over 15 years. These were the instruments of his liberation. The museum created a special exhibit around the discovery. The tools were displayed alongside copies of the auction records, the incident reports, and photographs of Solomon's descendants. The exhibit traveled to museums in Canada and the United States, bringing Solomon's story to audiences who had never heard it before. And in the guest book that accompanied the exhibit, visitors left thousands of messages. Many of them said the same thing. He gave me hope. That is Solomon's true legacy. Not the technical achievement of escaping from chains, though that was remarkable enough. Not the physical courage of returning to the South to rescue his wife, though that required more bravery than most people will ever need to summon. His true legacy is the hope he planted in human hearts. The belief that the impossible is not always impossible. The conviction that systems built to contain the human spirit will always, eventually, fail. Solomon Beaumont was not a supernatural being. He could not walk through walls or turn invisible. He was a man, intelligent, determined, patient, and brave. He faced a system designed to break him, and he refused to break. He faced locks designed to hold him, and he opened them. He faced a choice between personal freedom and the woman he loved, and he chose love. These are not superhuman qualities. They are deeply human ones, and that is the most important lesson of Solomon's story. What he did, others can do. What he was, others can be. The locks that bind us are real, but so are the keys. Sometimes those keys take 15 years to forge. Sometimes they require the help of networks and allies and ancestors. Sometimes they demand risks that seem unreasonable and sacrifices that seem too great. But they exist. They are waiting to be made. They are waiting to be used. On a spring day in 2019, a group of students from a high school in New Orleans made a field trip to the building that was once the St. Louis Hotel. The auction room is now an upscale restaurant, its dark history obscured by white tablecloths and expensive wine lists. The students stood in the room where Solomon had stood more than 160 years before. They looked at the rotunda ceiling and the curved balcony and the polished floors. Their teacher told them the story. She told them about the chains and the platform and the auctioneer's gavel. She told them about the 30 seconds of distraction and the trap door and the tunnel. She told them about the 11-day journey through swamps and the midnight rescue and the long walk to freedom. And when she finished, one of the students raised her hand. "What happened to the people who helped him?" she asked. "The sailors and the doctor and the carpenter. What happened to them?" The teacher smiled. "They kept helping others," she said. "Marchand organized dozens more escapes from Haiti. Dr. Beaumont continued his work until the war. The network grew and spread. By the time slavery ended, thousands of people had traveled the same routes that Solomon traveled, helped by the same kinds of people who helped him." The student nodded. "Then it was not just one man," she said. "It was a whole system. Like theirs, but going the other way." The teacher nodded back. "Exactly," she said. "They had a system of oppression, and we built a system of liberation. Both systems were made of people, making choices, taking risks, doing what they believed was right. The question is always the same. Which system will you be part of?" The students left the restaurant and walked out into the New Orleans sunshine. They crossed the street and continued their tour, visiting other sites, learning other stories. But some of them carried Solomon with them. Some of them remembered the man who refused to stay on the platform, who walked back into danger for love, who forged his own keys and opened his own locks. Some of them began to wonder what keys they might need to forge, what locks they might need to open, what systems they might need to resist. There is a saying among the descendants of Solomon Beaumont, passed down through generations like a family heirloom. They say it at gatherings and reunions, at weddings and funerals, at moments of celebration and moments of grief. The saying goes like this: "The lock has not been made that can hold a Beaumont." It is not true in any literal sense. Solomon's descendants have faced locks of all kinds, The locks of racism, of poverty, of limited opportunity, of prejudice. Some of those locks have held them, at least for a time. But the saying is not meant literally. It is meant as a reminder. A reminder that their ancestor refused to accept the limits that others placed on him. A reminder that he spent 15 years preparing for a single moment of opportunity. A reminder that he succeeded not because he was superhuman, but because he was deeply, profoundly, stubbornly human. The lock has not been made that can hold a Beaumont. It means, do not give up. It means, prepare for your moment. It means, find your allies, learn your craft, forge your tools. It means, when the distraction comes, when every eye turns away, when you have your 3 seconds of opportunity, be ready. And move. This is the story of Solomon Beaumont. This is the secret of the man who escaped during the auction. He was not magic. He was not lucky. He was prepared. And when preparation met opportunity, freedom was born. That is his gift to history. That is his message to us. Prepare. Wait. Move. Be free.